The stars had never cared about right or wrong. They simply burned, cold and silent, while empires rose and fell beneath them. For 10,000 years, one empire had burned brighter than all the rest. It was called the Corveth Dominion, and it ruled a third of the known galaxy, with an iron fist wrapped in soft words. The Dominion did not call itself cruel. It called itself efficient. When it found a species too weak to defend itself, it did not destroy them. That would have been wasteful. Instead, it conquered them, cataloged them, and put them to work. Some species mined, some species farmed, some species fought and died in the Dominion's endless wars, sent to the front lines as living shields so that true Corveth soldiers could stay safe behind them. The Vayrans were one such species. They were a peaceful, quiet people, tall and thin, with skin like pale blue silk and eyes that could see in the dark. They had never wanted war. They had built cities of glass and song, and their greatest achievement was not a weapon, but a language so beautiful that other species wept when they heard it sung. It did not matter. The Dominion came anyway, because the Vayrans had rich mineral deposits beneath their oceans, and the Dominion wanted them. That had been 300 years ago. Since then, the Vayrans had lived as servants in their own star system, forced to mine the deep seas of their homeworld for a masters who saw them as tools with a pulse. Children were taken from their parents at a certain age and sent to work camps on distant moons. Anyone who resisted disappeared. Anyone who sang too loudly was silenced. By the time this story begins, the Vayrans had almost forgotten what freedom felt like. Almost. A young Vayran engineer named Elira Voss had not forgotten. She worked in the deep mining stations beneath the Vayran Ocean, where the pressure could crush a ship like a tin can, and where the Dominion kept its most valuable secrets. Elira was clever. She had learned to read Dominion technical manuals in secret, teaching herself their language of numbers and circuits, while pretending to be just another obedient worker. For 5 years, she had been quietly gathering pieces of an old, broken Dominion scout ship that had been left to rust in a forgotten hangar. Piece by piece, she had rebuilt it. Piece by piece, she had planned her escape. She was not escaping alone. 12 other Vayrans, families with small children, elders who remembered the old songs, had trusted her with their lives. On a night when the twin moons of their homeworld were dark and the Dominion patrol ships were thin, Elira led them through the flooded tunnels to the hangar, sealed them inside the little ship, and launched it into space before anyone could stop her. The ship was old and slow. It had no weapons. It barely had enough fuel to make a single long jump through hyperspace. Elira did not know where that jump would take them. She only knew it had to be far away from the Dominion, farther than any Dominion patrol had ever gone. She set the coordinates for the emptiest, most unmapped region she could find on the old ship's star charts, said a quiet prayer in the old Vayran tongue, and pulled the lever. The ship screamed through hyperspace for 6 days. When it finally dropped back into normal space, its engines were dying, its hull was cracking, and its passengers were nearly out of air and water. Elira looked out the viewport and saw a yellow star with 8 planets circling it. The third planet was blue and green, wrapped in white clouds, and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache with a memory of home. She did not know it yet, but she had just found Earth. 200 kilometers below, in a control room in Colorado, an alarm began to blare. A tracking officer named David Reyes nearly spilled his coffee across his console. In 30 years of watching the skies, he had never seen a signature like this. It was not a meteor. It was not space debris. It was a ship, and it was not one that any nation on Earth had built. "Sir, you need to see this," Reyes said, and his supervisor came running. Within an hour, every major government on Earth had been notified. Within 3 hours, a joint task force of the United Nations Space Defense Council had scrambled 2 orbital shuttles to intercept the strange craft, which was now drifting, powerless, in high orbit above the Pacific Ocean. Nobody knew what to expect. Some feared an invasion. Others hoped for peaceful contact, something humanity had dreamed about since it first looked up at the stars. What they found, when they finally boarded the broken ship, was neither. They found 13, exhausted, starving, terrified people who were not human, huddled together in the dark, protecting their children with their own bodies. The Vayrens did not attack, they did not resist. Illyra Voss, weak from days without proper food, raised her hands slowly and spoke words that no human understood, in a voice that trembled with exhaustion, but also, strangely, with hope. The first human to reach her was a young medic named Sarah Chen. She was not a diplomat, she was not a soldier. She was simply the first person through the airlock, and when she saw the state of the children aboard that ship, thin and frightened and covered in old scars, she did not wait for orders. She knelt down, opened her medical kit, and began to help. It took 3 weeks to build a way for humans and Vayrens to understand each other. Earth's best linguists, working with an AI translation program built specifically for the task, slowly pieced together the Vayren language from recordings, gestures, and patient repetition. The Slira Voss, though weak, refused to rest until she could tell someone, anyone, what had happened to her people and why. When she finally could speak in halting, broken English, the first thing she said to the assembled council of human leaders was not a request for asylum. It was a warning. "You do not know what is coming," she said. "The Dominion does not forgive those who escape. They will search for us. And when they find where we went, they will come for you too." The room went silent. A 4-star general named Marcus Reyes, no relation to the tracking officer who had first spotted the ship, leaned forward and asked the question everyone was thinking. "Who is the Dominion?" Illyra's pale blue eyes filled with old grief. She told them everything. She told them about the conquest of her world 300 years ago. She told them about the mines beneath the ocean, about the children taken from their families, about the countless other species enslaved across a third of the galaxy. She told them about the Dominion's core belief, spoken by its leaders for 1,000 years, that any species too weak to defend itself did not deserve to remain free, and that mercy was a weakness the strong could not afford. She told them about the overlord who ruled it all, a being named Kos Threx, who had conquered more worlds in his lifetime than any ruler in Dominion history, and who was said to have never once shown mercy to an enemy who begged for it. When she finished, the room was silent for a long time. Finally, General Reyes spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "And you came here because you thought we might be strong enough to survive them." Illyra shook her head slowly. "No. We came here because we had nowhere else to go. We did not know you existed. We did not know if this star had any life at all. We simply ran, and we were lucky." She paused. "But now that I have seen your world, I think you should be very afraid. The Dominion does not like worlds it does not control. And a world full of people as young and as curious as yours, they will not ignore you forever." Those words would prove to be the truest thing anyone had said in that room in years. It took the Dominion 4 months to find the trail Illyra's ship had left through hyperspace. 4 months in which humanity argued, debated, and slowly came to understand just how small and unprepared it truly was. Earth had rockets and satellites and dreams of Mars, but it had nothing that could stand against a fleet built by a civilization that had been conquering star systems since before humans had learned to farm. But Earth also had something the Dominion had never accounted for. It had a species that had spent its entire history fighting itself, inventing new ways to survive against impossible odds, and refusing, again and again, throughout every dark age and every plague and every war, to simply give up. When the first Dominion scout ship arrived at the edge of the solar system, cloaked and silent, sent to confirm the rumors of a human civilization, it found something it did not expect. It found a species that, upon learning an ancient empire of enslavers might be coming to conquer them, had not panicked. It had not surrendered before the fight had even begun. It had started building. Every shipyard on Earth was retooled within weeks, guided by Vayren engineering knowledge and old human ingenuity working together for the first time. Every nation set aside its old quarrels, at least for now, because for the first time in human history, the greatest threat was not another human nation. It was something out there in the dark, watching, waiting, and coming closer every single day. Illyra Voss, once a frightened refugee, found herself standing on the observation deck of humanity's first true warship, a vessel built in record time using stolen Dominion technology, and human stubbornness in equal measure. She looked out at the stars that had once been her prison, and felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. Beside her stood Sarah Chen, no longer just a medic, but now one of the lead liaisons between humanity and the Veyron survivors. And beside her stood General Reyes, who had been given command of Earth's newest and only fleet. "They'll come," Illyra said quietly. "The Dominion never lets anything go free. Not truly." "Let them come," Reyes said, his eyes fixed on the black horizon of space. "They've never met us before." None of them knew yet just how true those words would become, or how, in the years ahead, it would not be humanity that would beg the Dominion for mercy. It would be the other way around. In the weeks after that first meeting, Illyra Voss found herself spending long hours with human scientists who wanted to understand everything about the ship she had escaped in. She did not mind. Every question they asked told her something about how humans thought, and what she learned surprised her more each day. The Veyrons had lived under Dominion rule for so long that they had come to see technology as something handed down from above, something you were permitted to use, never something you were free to question or change. Dominion engineers designed the machines. Conquered species operated them, exactly as instructed, and never dared to ask why a system worked the way it did. Curiosity, Illyra had learned as a child, was dangerous. Curiosity got people noticed, and being noticed by the Dominion rarely ended well. Humans were nothing like that. The first time she showed a group of engineers the scout ship's damaged hyperdrive core, they did not simply nod and accept her explanation of how it worked. They asked why it worked that way. They asked what would happen if certain parts were changed. They took the whole thing apart, piece by piece, laid every component out on a table, and argued with each other for hours about better ways it could have been built. At first, this frightened her. She kept expecting someone to appear and punish them for their disrespect toward Dominion engineering. No one ever did. Slowly, she began to understand that this constant questioning, this refusal to simply accept things as they were, was not disrespect at all. It was simply how humans approached everything, and it was, she began to realize, exactly the kind of thinking that might one day save them all. The other Veyron refugees adjusted to life on Earth in their own ways. The children, still young enough to learn quickly, picked up English within months, and began attending human schools alongside human children, an experience that was strange and difficult for everyone involved, but that slowly, steadily, built friendships that no one could have predicted. The elders struggled more. They had lived under Dominion rule for most of their long lives, and freedom, real freedom, was harder for them to trust. Some of them still flinched at loud noises, still lowered their eyes out of old habit when human officials entered a room, still could not quite believe that no one was going to punish them for speaking too freely. Sarah Chen spent countless hours simply sitting with the older Veyrons, listening to their stories, helping them understand that here, on this world, they did not need to be afraid anymore. It was slow work. Trust, once broken as thoroughly as the Dominion had broken it, did not rebuild itself quickly. But it did rebuild, day by day, conversation by conversation, and by the time the first Dominion scout ship arrived to investigate the rumors of a human civilization, something had changed in the Veyron refugees that even they had not fully noticed happening. They had started to hope again, and more than that, they had started to believe that hope might actually be worth something this time. Meanwhile, the leaders of Earth's nations faced a challenge unlike any in human history. For the first time, humanity was not simply arguing about borders or resources or old grievances between neighboring countries. It was facing a threat that did not care about any of those divisions, a threat that would treat all of humanity exactly the same, regardless of which flag a person happened to live under. The United Nations Space Defense Council, once a mostly ceremonial body with limited real authority, found itself thrust into a role no one had prepared it for. Difficult meetings stretched late into the night as representatives from every major power argued over how to allocate resources, how to share newly acquired Dominion technology, and who would ultimately hold command over the fleet that would need to be built. There were moments when the old rivalries threatened to tear the entire effort apart before it had even properly begun. It was Fleet Admiral Reyes, then still a general, who finally cut through the arguing, with a simple, blunt statement during one particularly heated session. "It does not matter whose flag is on the ship when the Dominion arrives," he said. "It only matters whether that ship can fight. We can argue about credit and control after we have survived long enough for it to matter. Right now, every hour we spend arguing is an hour we are not spending building." The words landed hard in that room, and though the political arguments never fully disappeared, something shifted after that meeting. Nations that had spent decades competing in every other arena began, however reluctantly, to cooperate in this one. Shipyards were built jointly. Engineering teams were assembled from dozens of countries, working together in ways that would have seemed impossible only a few years before. It was not perfect unity. It never would be. But it was enough, and in the end, enough was exactly what was needed. By the time the first Dominion warships returned to the edge of the solar system, ready to deliver the conquest they believed would be quick and easy, humanity had built something that no one, not even the humans building it, had fully expected to see. A fleet, ready to fight for its home, and no intention whatsoever of losing. 5 years passed after the Dominion scout ship first entered Earth's solar system and quietly retreated without making contact. 5 years in which humanity did not waste a single day. The scout ship's captain, a Corvette officer named Drask Ven, had reported back to Dominion Command that the third planet held a young, primitive species with basic industrial technology and no meaningful defenses. He recommended it be added to the list of future conquests, low priority, easy target, to be dealt with whenever the Dominion had spare ships to send. He had no idea how wrong he was. He had seen a world with rockets and satellites. He had not seen what that world could become once it decided to survive. By the time the Dominion returned in force, Earth was no longer the world Drask Ven had reported on. Working side by side with the Varen refugees, human scientists and engineers had done what no one thought possible. They reverse-engineered the broken scout ship Alira Voss had escaped in, learning the secrets of Dominion hyperdrive engines, shield generators, and weapons systems. But humans did not simply copy what they found. They improved it, the same way they had always improved everything, from fire to flight to the internet. Where Dominion engines were reliable but slow to adapt, human engineers built engines that could push past their safety limits when a battle demanded it. Where Dominion shields were strong but predictable, human shields were designed to shift and change in ways that made them harder to break. Every nation on Earth contributed. Factories that had once built cars now built starship hulls. Universities that had once trained doctors and teachers now trained a new generation of combat pilots and fleet engineers. It was not easy. There were arguments. There were mistakes. Ships were built and found flawed and torn apart and rebuilt again. But slowly, painfully, and with a speed that stunned even the Varans who had lived 100 years under Dominion rule, a fleet began to take shape in orbit above Earth. Alira Voss became one of its lead engineers. She had spent her whole life being told that her people were not strong enough to fight back. Now she stood on the deck of a shipyard in Earth orbit, watching human welders and Varen technicians work together beneath the stars, building something that had never existed before. A fleet, built by two species who had chosen freedom over fear. General Marcus Reyes, now Fleet Admiral Reyes, commanded that fleet. He was not a young man, and he had seen enough of humanity's own wars to know that courage alone did not win battles. It took planning. It took patience. It took a willingness to make hard choices when the moment called for them. He spent those 5 years training pilots, testing weapons, and above all, listening to Alira and the other Varen survivors, learning everything he could about the enemy that was coming. "They are patient," Alira told him one night, standing beside a viewport that looked out over the growing fleet. "They do not rush. When they decide a world is theirs, they simply wait until it is ready to be taken. That is what frightens me most. It has been 5 years. 5 years is nothing to them." "Then we use that patience against them," Reyes said. "If they think we're still primitive, still weak, they won't send their full strength. Not at first." He was right. When the Dominion returned, it did not send its full might. It sent a modest invasion fleet of 40 warships, commanded by a Corvette admiral named Threx Vale, distant cousin of the Overlord himself, eager to prove his family's loyalty by delivering a new, easy conquest. 40 warships was more than enough, by Dominion calculations, to bring a primitive species to its knees. It was the same size fleet that had conquered a dozen other young civilizations before, always ending the same way: a show of overwhelming force, a brief and one-sided battle, and a surrender. They arrived at the edge of the solar system on a quiet morning, sensors sweeping ahead of them, expecting to find a world defended by little more than a handful of primitive rockets. Instead, they found a wall of steel. Earth's fleet, 200 ships strong, human-built and Varen-guided, was waiting for them at the edge of the asteroid belt, arranged not in the open, obvious formations the Dominion expected from a young species, but in careful, layered positions that used the asteroids themselves as cover. It was a formation Fleet Admiral Reyes had studied from Earth's own naval history, adapted for the void of space, and it caught the Dominion completely by surprise. Admiral Threx Vale, watching from the bridge of his flagship, felt the first stirrings of doubt he had felt in decades. "This is not what the scout reported," he said to his second-in-command. "This world was primitive. 5 years ago, perhaps," his second-in-command replied grimly, watching the sensor readings update in real time. "It appears they have not been idle." The battle that followed would later be studied by military historians on Earth for generations, and it would become known simply as the Battle of the Belt. The Dominion fleet advanced in its traditional formation, confident that their superior numbers and centuries of combat experience would break the human line within hours. What they had not accounted for was that humans did not fight like every other species the Dominion had conquered. Most conquered species fought bravely, sometimes desperately, but always within limits, always holding something back, always hoping that if they did not resist too fiercely, the Dominion might show some small mercy. Humans had no such hope, and so they had no such limits. Fleet Admiral Reyes gave the order to engage, and Earth's ships surged forward from behind the asteroids in a coordinated assault that used every trick human military history could offer. Fighter squadrons darted between the larger warships, using speed and agility the slower, heavier Dominion craft could not match. Human engineers had built their shields to absorb sudden overloads rather than fail gracefully, meaning Dominion weapons that should have disabled a ship in one hit instead found themselves fighting through defenses that simply refused to give up. Illyra Voss, aboard the command ship with Reyes, watched the battle unfold on the main view screen with her heart in her throat. She had seen Dominion fleets fight before, from a distance, and she had seen them win every single time. She had never seen them fight an enemy that fought back like this. "They are not retreating," she said in disbelief, watching a squadron of human fighters press an attack against a Dominion cruiser twice their size, taking heavy losses but refusing to break off. "Why are they not retreating?" "Because retreating means the fight isn't over," Reyes said quietly, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. "And it isn't." The battle raged for 6 hours. It was not a clean victory. Earth lost 30 ships and hundreds of pilots and crew, a wound that would be felt across the entire planet for years to come. But when it was over, 28 Dominion warships had been destroyed, and the remaining 12, badly damaged and their admiral gravely wounded, retreated in a panic that Dominion doctrine had no protocol for. They had never needed a protocol for retreat before. They had never needed to run. Admiral Threx Vale did not survive the journey home. He died of his wounds 3 days into the retreat, his final report transmitted back to Dominion Command in broken, desperate fragments, warning of a species that fought like nothing the Dominion had ever encountered, a species that did not know how to surrender. That report reached the desk of Overlord Cos Threx himself. He read it twice, in silence, in the dark heart of the Dominion's capital world, a place of black spires and endless shadow, where no light of mercy had ever been allowed to shine. Then he set the report down, called for his war council, and said 6 words that would echo through Dominion history. "Send everything. End this quickly." Back on Earth, the celebration of victory was quiet and heavy with grief. 30 ships lost. Hundreds of families changed forever. But something else had changed too, something the Dominion could not yet see. Word of the battle had spread, carried by Varen refugees and old smuggling networks that stretched further into Dominion space than anyone had suspected, whispered from world to world among species who had lived under the Dominion's boot for centuries. a young species from a world called Earth, had fought the Dominion and won. For the first time in 300 years, in slave camps and mining stations and conquered cities across a third of the galaxy, people who had long ago given up hope began, quietly, carefully, to hope again. Elira Voss stood beside Fleet Admiral Reyes in the aftermath of the battle, looking out at the wreckage of Dominion ships drifting silently among the asteroids, and felt tears on her face that were not entirely made of grief. "They will send everything now," she said. "The Overlord will not allow this to stand." "Let him send everything," Reyes said, and though his voice was tired, it did not waver. "We'll be ready, and this time we won't be fighting alone." He was right. Word had already reached other worlds, other conquered species who had watched the battle from a distance and dared, for the first time in living memory, to reach out and ask a question none of them had ever dared to ask before. "Can we help you fight?" In the days after the battle, Earth mourned. Every human lost in the fighting was given a proper funeral, and for the first time, the Veyron survivors stood alongside human families at those funerals, singing the old Veyron songs of mourning, a tradition that had once been forbidden under Dominion rule. Elira Voss led the singing herself at the first of these ceremonies, her voice breaking as she sang for people she had known for only a handful of years, but had come to love as deeply as anyone from her own homeworld. "We do not have to be afraid of grief," she told Sarah Chen afterward, wiping tears from her eyes. "The Dominion taught us that grief was a weakness to hide, but grief is not weakness. It is proof that something mattered enough to be lost." The wounded were cared for in hospitals across the planet, and Sarah Chen worked longer hours than she had ever worked in her life, coordinating care not just for human patients, but for the small number of Veyron volunteers who had insisted on serving alongside human crews during the battle, despite having no combat training of their own. Several had died, more had been wounded. Sarah never forgot their names, and years later, she could still recite each one from memory. Fleet Admiral Reyes, meanwhile, faced the difficult task of rebuilding a fleet that had just lost 30 ships, while knowing that the Dominion's response, whatever it would be, was still to come. He pushed the shipyards harder than ever, but he also pushed for something else, something that surprised many of the human officials who had grown used to his blunt, practical manner. He pushed for peace, at least among humans. "We cannot keep fighting each other while we prepare to fight them," he told the council in the weeks after the battle. "Every resource spent on old rivalries is a resource not spent on survival. I am not asking anyone to forget their differences forever. I am asking you to set them aside long enough for our children to have a future to argue about." It was not an easy request, and it was not fully honored. Old tensions between nations did not simply vanish because a common enemy had appeared in the sky. But something had shifted, slowly and unevenly, across the Earth in those years. People who had once seen each other as rivals began to see each other, more and more, simply as fellow humans, standing together against something far larger than any of their old quarrels had ever been. The Veyron survivors played their own quiet role in this shift. Elira Voss, in particular, became something of a symbol, not because she sought that role, but because her story, a young engineer who had risked everything to lead her people to freedom, resonated with humans in a way that transcended language and culture. She was invited to speak before the United Nations General Assembly 18 months after her arrival, and though her English was still imperfect, her words moved the room to silence. "I did not come here because I believed you could save us," she told the assembled representatives of nearly 200 nations. "I came here because we had nowhere else to run, and this was the only star we could reach. But I have watched you these past months, and I have seen something I had almost forgotten was possible. I have seen a people choose, again and again, to fight for something larger than themselves, even when the cost was terrible, even when giving up would have been so much easier. My people forgot how to do that a long time ago. You are teaching us how to remember." The speech was broadcast across the planet, translated into dozens of languages, and in homes and schools and workplaces across every continent, people who had spent years afraid of what was coming from the stars found themselves, for the first time, feeling something closer to determination than fear. The shipyards worked around the clock. New pilots trained in simulators built using data recovered from the Dominion scout ship's own combat logs. Scientists raced to improve shield technology, weapons systems, and hyperdrive engines, often working in shifts that left them exhausted but unwilling to stop. Every improvement, however small, was shared freely between nations, an arrangement that would have seemed unthinkable only a few years earlier. And slowly, ship by ship, Earth's fleet grew larger, stronger, and more prepared for what everyone now understood was coming. Not if the Dominion returned in greater force, but when. Illyra Voss spent those years working closely with human engineers, applying everything she had secretly learned during her years as a Dominion mining engineer to help design systems that combined the best of both worlds' knowledge. She never stopped thinking about her homeworld, about the family members and friends still trapped under Dominion rule, still waiting, without knowing it, for a chance at freedom that was slowly being built 4 light-years away. Someday, she told Reyes one evening, watching the shipyards glow in the darkness of Earth's orbit, we will go back. Not just to fight, to free them. We will, Reyes promised her. But first, we have to survive what's coming. Everything else depends on that. He was right, and neither of them yet knew just how close that survival would come to failing, or how much the battle ahead would cost everyone who had worked so hard to prepare for it. In the 2 years that followed the Battle of the Belt, something happened across a third of the galaxy that the Dominion had never planned for and never believed possible. It began small, as these things often do. A message smuggled from a mining station on a distant moon. A whispered rumor passed between traders who were not supposed to be talking to each other. A single word, spoken carefully in dozens of different languages across dozens of different worlds. Earth. The Vayrans were not the only species the Dominion had conquered. There were the Corvani, a race of quiet, patient stone builders whose ancestors had raised cities that still stood 1,000 years later, now forced to mine those same ancient cities for resources under Dominion guard. There were the Threll, small, fast, clever creatures who had once been among the greatest shipbuilders in the galaxy, now forced to build Dominion warships instead of their own. There were a dozen other species besides, each conquered in their own time, each broken in their own way, each one having long ago concluded that resistance was pointless, because no one had ever beaten the Dominion before. Until now. Illyra Voss had spent those 2 years doing something she had once thought impossible. Using old smuggling routes that the Dominion had never fully managed to shut down, she and a small team of Veyran and human volunteers began quietly making contact with resistance cells on other conquered worlds. Most were small. Most were frightened. Most had been waiting decades for a sign that fighting back was not simply a slower way to die. The Battle of the Belt gave them that sign. One by one, cautiously, resistance leaders from a dozen worlds reached out through the old smuggling networks, asking the same question. Is it true? Did a species really stand against the Dominion and win? And when the answer came back, confirmed again and again by traders and refugees who had seen the wreckage of the Dominion fleet with their own eyes, something began to shift across the conquered worlds of the Dominion that no army could have caused on its own. Hope spread faster than any fleet could travel. By the time the Dominion's true invasion force arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system, it was not just a human and Veyran fleet waiting for them. It was a coalition, small and imperfect and still learning to work together, but real. Corvani engineers had smuggled themselves to Earth aboard cargo ships, bringing knowledge of Dominion fortification technology that even the Veyrans did not have. Threll shipbuilders arrived with designs for fast, agile fighter craft that put even human engineering to shame. Volunteers from half a dozen other conquered species, some soldiers, some simply desperate people with nothing left to lose, joined the growing fleet in Earth's orbit. Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes stood on the bridge of Earth's new flagship, a vessel built with human steel, Veyran engines, Corvani armor, and Threll weapons systems, and looked out at a fleet of 450 ships representing 7 different species, all of them united by one simple, powerful idea. They did not have to be afraid anymore. Overlord Kosthrex is sending his second fleet, Illyra told the assembled council 2 days before the invasion arrived, her voice steady, despite the weight of what she was about to say. 200 warships. His personal war commander, a Corveth general named Draven Kor, will lead them himself. He has never lost a battle. Neither have we, Reyes said quietly. Not the ones that mattered. The battle that followed would come to be known across a dozen worlds simply as the Reckoning. General Dravenkor was not a fool, unlike his predecessor. He had studied every detail of the Battle of the Belt, had reviewed every scrap of sensor data his engineers could recover, and had built his strategy specifically to counter the tactics that had destroyed Admiral Vale's fleet. He did not send his ships in a single overwhelming wave. He split his fleet into 3 groups, planning to surround the human coalition from multiple directions at once, cutting off any retreat and overwhelming their defenses with sheer coordinated firepower. It should have worked. Against any other species the Dominion had ever fought, it would have worked. But General Kor had made one mistake that no amount of studying sensor data could have prepared him for. He had assumed that a coalition of 7 different species, most of whom had never fought alongside one another before, would be slow to coordinate, prone to confusion, easily divided by his 3-pronged attack. He did not understand humans. Humans had spent their entire history building alliances out of chaos. Every war Earth had ever fought had taught its people, sometimes at terrible cost, how to combine different forces, different languages, different strengths, into something greater than the sum of its parts. Fleet Admiral Reyes had spent 2 years training exactly for this moment, drilling human, Veyron, Corvani, and Threll crews together, until they could respond to a shifting battle as a single organism rather than 4 separate fleets bolted together. When General Kor's 3-pronged attack began, the coalition fleet did not scatter in confusion. It bent, flexed, and reformed with a speed that stunned the Dominion war commander watching from his flagship. Threll fighters, the fastest ships in the coalition, darted between the 3 Dominion groups, disrupting their coordination before they could properly surround their target. Corvani engineers had reinforced Earth's outer defense platforms with fortification technology the Dominion had never seen used defensively before, turning what should have been an easy breakthrough point into a slaughterhouse for Dominion assault craft. Veyron technicians kept the coalition's shields adapting in real time, learning from every Dominion weapon that struck them, and adjusting to resist the next hit just a little better. And at the center of it all, human warships fought the way humans had always fought when everything was on the line, without hesitation, without holding back, and without the slightest intention of losing. The battle raged for 2 full days. General Dravenkor, watching his carefully planned 3-pronged assault dissolve into chaos, made increasingly desperate attempts to break the coalition's coordination, throwing wave after wave of his best ships against Earth's defenses. Each wave was met, absorbed, and turned back. By the end of the 2nd day, of the 200 warships he had brought with him, only 40 remained combat-capable. General Kor made his final decision on the bridge of his flagship, watching the wreckage of his once proud fleet burn silently in the void around him. He had never lost a battle. He had never once, in a 40-year career, considered what it would feel like to surrender. He considered it now. His communications officer, trembling, informed him that the human flagship was hailing them, offering terms. General Kor almost refused out of pure pride, but he looked at the tactical display, at the 40 broken ships that remained under his command, at the crews who had trusted him to bring them home, and he made the only choice that would not condemn every one of them to death for nothing. He opened the channel. Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes appeared on the screen, tired, his uniform stained with the marks of 2 days without proper rest, but his eyes steady and clear. "General Kor," Reyes said, "your fleet is beaten. Surrender your remaining ships, and I give you my word that your crews will be treated according to the laws of war. No one else needs to die today." General Kor stared at the human on his screen for a long moment. In 300 years of Dominion conquest, no enemy had ever offered the Dominion mercy. It had always been the other way around, the Dominion offering conquered species the choice between servitude and destruction, always graciously calling it mercy when it was simply the absence of complete annihilation. "Why?" Kor finally asked, his voice hoarse. "Why would you offer us this?" Reyes's expression did not change. "Because we're not you," he said simply. "Surrender your fleet, General. This is the only offer you're going to get." General Dravenkor surrendered 40 ships and nearly 6,000 Dominion crew members that day, the first significant surrender of Dominion forces in the Empire's entire recorded history. It sent shockwaves through Dominion Command that would take years to fully understand. But it was what happened next, in the weeks that followed, that would truly change the shape of the war, and the shape of everything that came after. Because among the prisoners taken that day was not just General Dravencore himself, but a small group of Dominion officials who had been traveling with the invasion fleet as observers, sent by the Overlord to record the conquest of Earth for the Dominion's historical archives. Officials who, when the Coalition began questioning captured prisoners, revealed something that Illyra Voss and every other conquered species leader in the Coalition had feared but never been able to prove. Records. Detailed, methodical Dominion records, kept with the same cold efficiency the Dominion applied to everything, documenting 300 years of conquest across dozens of worlds. Records of exactly how many people had been taken from their families. Records of exactly how many resistance leaders had been executed as examples. Records, catalogued and filed away in bloodless bureaucratic language, of atrocities that the Dominion had never bothered to hide from itself, because it had never once imagined that anyone would ever hold it accountable for them. Illyra Voss read through the first files with her own eyes, her hands shaking, and found the exact date, 300 years ago, when the Dominion had first arrived at her homeworld. She found the names of the first resistance leaders executed to discourage rebellion. She found, coldly listed among thousands of similar entries, the exact number of Veyran children who had been taken to work camps over 3 centuries, a number so large that she had to set the file down and simply breathe for several minutes before she could continue reading. When she finally brought the records to Fleet Admiral Reyes and the rest of the Coalition Council, her voice was quiet but absolutely steady. "This is everything," she said. "Every world, every atrocity. They kept records of all of it, because they never believed they would need to hide it from anyone." Reyes looked through the files in silence for a long time. Around him, the leaders of 7 different species, humans and Veyrans and Corvani and Threll and others besides, waited to hear what he would say. "Then we're going to need all of it," he finally said. "Because when this war ends, and it will end, we are not simply going to defeat the Dominion. We are going to make sure the entire galaxy knows exactly what it did." Far away, in the black spires of the Dominion capital, Overlord Kos Threx received news of General Kor's surrender with a silence that terrified everyone in his war council. For 300 years he had ruled through fear, certain that no species would ever be strong enough, or foolish enough, to challenge him directly. Now a young species from a small blue world had defeated 2 of his fleets in a row, and worse, had somehow uncovered records that the Overlord had never imagined anyone outside the Dominion would ever see. He rose from his throne, his shadow stretching long across the black stone floor, and for the first time in 3 centuries, Overlord Kos Threx felt something he had made an entire empire feel in his place for 300 years. Fear. Back at Earth, the aftermath of the reckoning brought challenges that no one in the Coalition had fully anticipated. Housing and caring for nearly 6,000 Dominion prisoners of war was a logistical burden that stretched Earth's resources thin, and it raised uncomfortable questions that the Coalition Council debated for weeks. Some argued that the prisoners, many of whom had personally participated in the destruction of worlds like Illyra's, deserved no better treatment than the Dominion had ever given its own prisoners. Others argued that treating them cruelly would make the Coalition no better than the empire it was fighting against. It was Illyra Voss, once again, who found herself at the center of that debate, and her position surprised many who expected her, given everything she had suffered, to argue for the harshest possible treatment. "I understand the anger," she told the council. "I have more reason than most people in this room to want them to suffer. But if we treat them the way the Dominion treated us, then what exactly have we won? A war is not just about defeating an enemy's ships. It is about proving that there is a better way to live than the one they offered us. If we cannot prove that even now, when we finally have the power to choose differently, then we will have learned nothing from everything we have lost." Her words carried the debate, though not without lasting disagreement among some council members who had lost far too much to feel any generosity toward captured Dominion soldiers. In the end, the Coalition established a system of fair treatment for prisoners of war, guided by principles adapted from old human conventions on the laws of war, combined with input from every species now part of the growing alliance. It was imperfect. It satisfied no one completely, but it held, and over time, it became one of the defining principles of what the Free Worlds Alliance would eventually become. Among the captured Dominion officers, General Draven Kor proved to be an unexpected source of information. Disillusioned by his defeat and increasingly troubled by what he learned when Coalition investigators shared portions of the recovered Dominion records with him, portions detailing atrocities he had not personally ordered but had certainly benefited from throughout his career, Kor slowly began cooperating with Coalition intelligence efforts. He provided detailed information on Dominion fleet deployments, fortification technology, and the internal political structure of the Empire, information that would prove invaluable in the campaigns that followed. "I did not know the full extent of it," he told Illyra Voss, during one of their many conversations in the months following his capture. "I told myself the Dominion's rule was harsh but necessary, that conquered species were simply not capable of managing themselves as well as we could manage them for them. I told myself many things, over many years, to avoid looking too closely at what my career actually required of me." "And now," Illyra asked. Kor was quiet for a long moment. "Now I have seen the records I chose not to look at for 40 years. I do not know what forgiveness I deserve, if any. I only know that I no longer wish to serve an empire built on what those records describe." His cooperation, and his eventual public testimony about Dominion war crimes, would later be cited by historians as one of the turning points that helped the Free Worlds Alliance gather the evidence and momentum it needed for the campaigns still to come. Meanwhile, across the growing network of conquered worlds now inspired by Earth's example, resistance movements began coordinating with the Coalition in ways that had been impossible only years before. What had started as scattered, desperate rebellions slowly became something more organized, more deliberate, guided by shared intelligence and mutual support that no single conquered species could ever have built alone. Fleet Admiral Reyes found himself, more and more, serving not just as a military commander but as a diplomat, working to hold together an alliance of species who often disagreed sharply on strategy, priorities, and the pace at which the war should proceed. It was exhausting work, made bearable only by his growing trust in leaders like Illyra Voss, whose quiet wisdom helped smooth over disagreements that might otherwise have fractured the fragile coalition beyond repair. "We are building something that has never existed before," Reyes told her one night, reviewing reports from a dozen different worlds. "An alliance of equals, not a new empire wearing a different name. I only hope we can hold it together long enough to matter." "We will," Illyra said, with a conviction that came not from certainty, but from the simple refusal to imagine any other outcome. "Because for the first time in 300 years, we have something the Dominion never had to fight against. We have each other, freely, and not out of fear." It was that alliance, built slowly and painfully out of shared suffering and shared hope, that would ultimately carry the free worlds forward, into the campaigns that followed. Campaigns that would, in time, bring the war all the way to the doorstep of the Dominion's own capital. The war did not end with General Kor's surrender. It only grew larger. Word of the reckoning spread across the galaxy faster than any Dominion effort to contain it could manage. On world after conquered world, resistance movements that had spent decades hiding in shadows began to rise, no longer content to wait and hope. The Corvani homeworld rose in open rebellion 8 months after the reckoning, its ancient stone cities becoming battlegrounds as Dominion garrison forces found themselves suddenly, violently outnumbered by a population that had simply stopped being afraid. The Threll shipyards, forced for generations to build Dominion warships, began quietly sabotaging every vessel that left their docks, delaying Dominion fleet repairs by months at a time. Earth, now the unquestioned heart of a growing coalition that called itself simply the Free Worlds Alliance, became the destination for refugees, defectors, and volunteers from a dozen different species, all of them drawn by the same story that had once seemed impossible. A species existed that had fought the Dominion and won, twice, and was willing to help anyone else who wanted to do the same. Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes found himself no longer just commanding a fleet, but coordinating an entire war effort that spanned a growing section of the galaxy. It was exhausting, impossible work, made bearable only by the fact that he was not doing it alone. Illyra Voss had become the Alliance's chief liaison to the growing number of resistance movements, her quiet intelligence and personal history making her uniquely suited to earn the trust of species who had learned, through bitter experience, not to trust easily. Sarah Chen, once a simple medic, now ran the Alliance's growing network of hospitals and refugee support centers, caring for the flood of traumatized survivors that every liberated world produced. The war lasted 3 years. It was not glorious. It was not clean. Ships were lost. Soldiers, human and alien alike, died in numbers that would be mourned for generations. Worlds that had waited 300 years for freedom sometimes found that freedom came at a terrible cost, their cities scarred by fighting, their populations reduced by desperate Dominion reprisals against anyone suspected of aiding the rebellion. But slowly, world by world, fleet by fleet, the Dominion's grip on the galaxy began to break. The final campaign began when Fleet Admiral Reyes received intelligence, gathered painstakingly by resistance cells operating deep within Dominion territory, that Overlord Kos Threx himself had gathered the last of the Dominion's core fleet at the Empire's capital world, a heavily fortified planet called Corveth Prime, ringed by 3 layers of orbital defense platforms that no fleet in galactic history had ever successfully broken through. The Alliance Council debated for weeks about whether to attempt an assault on Corveth Prime at all. Some argued for patience, for continuing to liberate outlying worlds and letting the Dominion's power crumble slowly from the edges inward. Illyra Voss was the one who finally spoke the words that ended the debate. "Every day we wait, more people die under the Overlord's rule," she said quietly to the assembled council. "I understand the risk, but I have spent my entire life waiting for someone to be brave enough to end this. I am done waiting." The assault on Corveth Prime began 4 months later. It was the largest battle in the history of the Free Worlds Alliance, 700 ships from a dozen species converging on the Dominion capital in a coordinated assault that took every lesson learned from 3 years of war and threw it against the Empire's final, desperate defense. The battle lasted 5 days. The orbital defense platforms that had never been broken were broken. The Dominion's last core fleet, commanded personally by aging admirals who had spent their entire careers believing their empire invincible, was shattered beyond any hope of rebuilding. On the 6th day, with Alliance ships in full control of Corveth Prime's orbit and ground forces beginning to land on the capital world itself, Overlord Kos Threx did something he had never once done in 300 years of rule. He surrendered. Not because he wanted to. Every instinct in his ancient, cruel heart screamed against it. But he looked at the reports from his remaining commanders, at the total collapse of every defense he had spent his life building, and he understood, with the cold clarity that had made him a feared ruler for 3 centuries, that continued resistance would only mean the complete destruction of everything he still had left, including his own life, and the lives of everyone still loyal to him within the capital's walls. He requested terms. He requested specifically to speak with Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes. What he did not expect was who else would be waiting in that room. The surrender meeting took place aboard the Alliance flagship, in a conference room that had been hastily prepared for the occasion. Overlord Kos Threx arrived under heavy guard, stripped of his ceremonial weapons, flanked by 2 remaining advisors who looked as exhausted and defeated as their ruler. He was an imposing figure even in defeat, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark gray skin marked with the ceremonial scarring that denoted 3 centuries of conquest, his eyes cold and calculating even now. He had expected to face Fleet Admiral Reyes alone, perhaps with a few of his senior officers present. Military leaders negotiated with military leaders. That was how these things had always worked, in every conquest the Dominion had ever completed. Instead, he found the conference room filled with representatives from every species in the Free Worlds Alliance. Corvani elders who had lived through the destruction of their ancient cities, Threll shipbuilders who had spent generations building weapons meant to enslave others, and at the center of the room, standing beside Fleet Admiral Reyes, a Veyron woman he did not recognize, but who looked at him with an intensity that made even the Overlord feel, for just a moment, something uncomfortably close to fear. "Illyra Voss." "Overlord Kos Threx," Reyes said, his voice formal and even. "You have requested terms of surrender. Before we discuss them, There are people here who have waited a very long time to speak with you directly. The Overlord's eyes moved slowly across the room, cataloging faces, calculating threats out of pure old habit even now. When his gaze finally settled on Illyra Voss, something flickered behind his cold eyes, the faintest trace of recognition, though he had certainly never met this particular Veyron before in his life. He had simply learned across 300 years to recognize the look of someone who had lost everything and never fully stopped grieving it. "Speak then," he said, his voice carrying the last remnants of imperial authority even now, stripped of his fleet, his capital, and his empire. "I am told your kind values mercy. I am requesting it now, for myself and for those still loyal to me on this world. Grant us mercy, and I will ensure a complete and orderly transfer of what remains of Dominion territory to your alliance." The room went quiet. Every representative present understood the weight of this moment. 300 years of conquest, of atrocity, of suffering, across dozens of worlds, distilled into a single request from the being who had presided over all of it. Mercy. Illyra Voss stepped forward. Her hands were steady, though her heart pounded harder than it had during any battle of the entire war. She had imagined this moment for years, had pictured 100 different things she might say to the Overlord if she ever stood before him. She had imagined rage. She had imagined grief. She had imagined, in her darkest moments, simply asking him to explain how he could do what he had done to her people and sleep peacefully at night. But standing there, looking into the cold, calculating eyes of the man who had ordered the conquest of her homeworld before she was even born, none of those things felt right. None of them felt like they would actually matter. Instead, she asked him one question. It was not the question anyone in that room expected. It was not a question about mercy at all, not directly. It was simpler than that, and somehow far more devastating. "Overlord Kosthrex," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "In 300 years of conquest, how many worlds asked you for the same mercy you are asking us for now?" The Overlord's expression did not change immediately. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as though the question had not fully registered. "How many species?" Illyra continued, her voice still quiet but growing steadier with every word, "knelt before you, exactly as you are kneeling before us now, and begged for the mercy you are begging for today? How many worlds asked to keep their children? How many resistance leaders asked to be spared, before your soldiers executed them anyway, as examples? How many, Overlord? Tell this room the number. You kept records of everything else. I know you have the number." The silence that followed was absolute. Fleet Admiral Reyes did not move. Every representative in that room, human and alien alike, watched the Overlord's face, waiting. Overlord Kosthrex, who had ruled a third of the galaxy through fear for 3 centuries, who had never once in living memory been asked to account for his actions by anyone with the power to demand an answer, opened his mouth, and found that for the first time in his very long life, he did not know what to say. The war leading up to that moment had not been won easily, and it had not been won without cost. In the months following the assault on Corveth Prime, historians across the growing Free Worlds Alliance would spend years documenting every stage of the campaign, trying to understand exactly how a coalition that had not even existed a decade earlier had managed to break an empire 300 years in the making. Part of the answer, most agreed, lay in the sheer speed at which the coalition had grown. After the reckoning, world after conquered world had risen up, inspired by proof that the Dominion could actually be beaten. Fleet Admiral Reyes had spent those final years of the war constantly adapting his strategy, learning to coordinate not just human, Veyron, Corvani, and Threll forces, but eventually a dozen other species besides, each bringing their own strengths, their own historical grievances, and their own hard-won expertise to the growing alliance. The campaign to reach Corveth Prime itself had required liberating a chain of heavily fortified Dominion border worlds, each battle harder than the last, as the Empire, now fully aware of the threat it faced, threw everything it had left into slowing the Coalition's advance. Illyra Voss had been present for many of these battles, not as a soldier, but as the Coalition's chief liaison, working tirelessly to ensure that newly liberated populations received the support they needed to rebuild, even as the fighting continued elsewhere. She had seen terrible things in those years. She had seen worlds where Dominion garrison forces, facing certain defeat, chose to destroy what they could not hold rather than let it fall into coalition hands. She had seen refugee camps overflowing with survivors who had lost everything, families torn apart by decades of forced labor, now finally reunited, only to discover that reunion did not erase the years of suffering that had come before it. She had learned, more than she had ever wanted to learn, that victory and healing were not the same thing, and that one did not automatically bring the other. But she had also seen moments of extraordinary hope. She had stood in city squares on worlds that had lived under Dominion rule for over a century, watching entire populations celebrate their first day of true freedom, some of them so unfamiliar with the concept that they did not know quite how to react to it. She had watched Corvani elders, who remembered stories of their world before the Dominion's arrival passed down from their grandparents, weep as they saw Dominion garrison flags lowered from their ancient stone towers for the first time in generations. Fleet Admiral Reyes, for his part, had grown into a role far larger than he had ever expected when he first took command of Earth's small, untested fleet. He was no longer simply a human military commander. He had become, almost without realizing it, the central coordinating voice for an alliance that spanned dozens of worlds and species, a position that demanded not just tactical brilliance, but a deep, patient understanding of cultures and histories entirely foreign to his own. He carried the weight of every life lost under his command with a quiet, private grief that he rarely shared with anyone, though Alira Voss, who had come to know him well over the years, understood it without needing to be told. They had become, in their own way, essential partners in holding the fragile coalition together, each compensating for the other's blind spots, each trusting the other's judgment, in moments when the weight of decision-making threatened to become unbearable. When the assault on Corveth Prime finally began, both of them understood exactly what was at stake. A failure here would not simply mean a military defeat. It would mean the collapse of everything the Alliance had built, the crushing of hope that had taken root across a dozen worlds, the return of Dominion rule to territories that had only just begun to imagine a different future. The 5 days of fighting that followed were the hardest of the entire war. Coalition losses were heavy. Entire squadrons of Threll fighters were wiped out, attempting to breach the first layer of Corveth Prime's orbital defenses. Corvani ground forces, landing ahead of schedule to secure key defensive positions, suffered brutal casualties fighting through Dominion garrison troops who, unlike earlier in the war, now fought with the desperate ferocity of soldiers who understood they were defending the very last stronghold their empire had left. Fleet Admiral Reyes made the hardest decision of his career on the 4th day of the battle, committing the coalition's last reserve fleet, ships that had been held back specifically to cover a retreat if the assault failed, into one final, decisive push against the weakening Dominion defenses. It was a gamble that could have ended the war in complete disaster if it had failed. It did not fail. By the dawn of the 5th day, Corveth Prime's orbital defenses had finally been broken, and the Dominion's last core fleet, outmaneuvered and outnumbered by a coalition that had learned, through years of hard experience, exactly how to fight an enemy that had once seemed unbeatable, began to collapse. It was in the exhausted, grief-heavy aftermath of that victory that Overlord Kos Threx finally requested his surrender, and it was carrying the weight of everything that battle, and every battle before it, had cost, that Alira Voss walked into that conference room to face him. The silence in the conference room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Overlord Kos Threx, ruler of the Corveth Dominion for 300 years, stood before the assembled representatives of the Free Worlds Alliance and said nothing, because for the first time in his extraordinarily long life, he genuinely had no answer to give. Alira Voss did not look away from him. She had waited her entire life, without ever truly believing the moment would come, to stand in front of the being responsible for everything her people had suffered. Now that the moment was here, she found she did not need to shout. She did not need to threaten. The question itself, simple as it was, had done more damage to the Overlord's composure than any weapon ever could. "I do not have that number," the Overlord finally said, his voice quieter than anyone in the room had expected. It was not an admission of guilt, not exactly. It was something closer to genuine confusion, the sound of a being who had spent 3 centuries never once considering that such a number might matter. "You have it," Illyra said. "It is in your own records. Your officers kept careful notes of every world that asked for mercy, and every time that mercy was refused. We have read them. We have read the number for my own homeworld. Would you like to know it, Overlord? Would you like to know how many Veyron families asked to keep their children, and were refused?" The Overlord's 2 remaining advisors shifted uncomfortably beside him, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. The records existed. They had always existed, kept with the same cold, bureaucratic thoroughness the Dominion applied to everything, because the Dominion had never once believed anyone would live to hold it accountable for what those records contained. Fleet Admiral Reyes finally spoke, breaking the tension in the room with the calm, measured tone of a man who had thought carefully about this exact moment for a very long time. "Overlord Kaz-Threx," he said, "you came here asking us for mercy. You are asking a room full of people whose worlds you conquered, whose families you broke, whose children you stole, to give you something you never once gave to any of them in 300 years. Before we answer, I think it is only fair that you understand exactly what you are asking for." He gestured, and the lights in the conference room dimmed slightly as a large screen behind him activated, displaying, one after another, in the Overlord's own official records, in his own government's own carefully kept files, image after image, name after name, number after number. 300 years of conquest, condensed into a presentation that took less than 10 minutes to display in full, and left absolute silence in its wake. When it finished, Reyes turned back to the Overlord. "Every species in this room has the right to demand justice for what was done to them. Every species in this room has the right to demand your life, if that is what they decide justice requires. That would be within their power now, and no one here would stop them if that is what they choose." The Overlord's face had gone pale, his composure finally, completely broken. He had expected anger, he had expected threats, he had not expected to be shown, so plainly and so completely, the true scale of what he had spent 3 centuries building. "Then decide," he said, his voice hollow. "Whatever your judgment is, deliver it. I will not beg further." I have seen now that begging accomplishes nothing here. It was Illyra Voss who answered him, and her answer surprised everyone in the room, including, perhaps most of all, herself. "You are wrong," she said. "Begging accomplished something today. It showed this entire room exactly who you really are, when you had nothing left and no power to hide behind. But that is not why we will decide as we do." She looked around the room, at the Corvani elders, at the Threll shipbuilders, at every representative of every species the Dominion had conquered, and then back at the Overlord. "We are not going to execute you, Overlord Kaz-Threx, not because you deserve mercy. By your own definition, by your own 300 years of rule, you do not. But we are not you. We do not measure our strength by how much cruelty we are willing to inflict on those who cannot fight back. You will stand trial before representatives of every species you conquered, for every crime documented in your own records. You will answer, in detail, for every number on that screen. And whatever judgment that trial delivers, you will accept it, because that is what real justice looks like. Not a quick death that ends your suffering before you have to face what you did. A reckoning, slow and complete, exactly the way you made 300 years of worlds face what you did to them." The Overlord said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He was led away under guard, the first Dominion ruler in the Empire's history to face judgment rather than deliver it, and the room slowly began to empty, representatives of a dozen species leaving in silence to process what had just happened. Fleet Admiral Reyes remained behind with Illyra Voss, watching the empty screen where the Dominion's own records had just been displayed to the entire galaxy's assembled witnesses. "That was not the answer I expected you to give," he said quietly. Illyra was silent for a long moment before she answered. "Neither did I, until I was standing in front of him. I spent so many years imagining what I would say if I ever had this chance. I imagined rage. I imagined making him suffer exactly as my people suffered." She shook her head slowly. "But when I looked at him, kneeling there, asking for the one thing he never gave anyone else, I understood something. If we became him in that moment, if we simply repaid cruelty with cruelty, then everything we fought for would mean nothing. We would just be a new dominion with a different flag. Reyes nodded slowly. Humanity spent a long time learning that lesson too, the hard way, more than once. The trial of Chaos Threx lasted nearly a full year. Representatives from every conquered species presented evidence, testimony, and the Dominion's own records before a tribunal, made up of judges from across the new Free Worlds Alliance. The former overlord was found guilty of crimes that filled volumes, crimes that would be studied and remembered for generations, as a warning of what unchecked power could become. He was sentenced not to death but to spend the remainder of his long life confined, forced to bear witness, year after year, to the rebuilding of every world he had once ruled through fear, a living reminder that cruelty, however powerful it seemed, did not last forever. The Corveth Dominion, without its overlord and with its core fleet destroyed, did not survive as an empire. It fractured into dozens of independent worlds, some of them choosing to join the growing Free Worlds Alliance, others choosing to rebuild on their own terms. It was messy. It was imperfect. Old wounds did not heal overnight, and some scars would never fully fade. But for the first time in 300 years, no single power ruled a third of the galaxy through fear. Earth changed too, in ways its people were still learning to understand. It was no longer simply one small world on the edge of an unremarkable star system. It had become the heart of a growing alliance of free worlds, a place where representatives from a dozen species now lived and worked and, slowly, learned to trust one another. Illyra Voss remained there, continuing the work she had begun as a frightened refugee years before, helping to build something new out of the wreckage the Dominion had left behind. Fleet Admiral Reyes eventually stepped down from active command, though he remained a quiet, steady voice on the Alliance Council for the rest of his life. Sarah Chen's network of hospitals and support centers grew into something the entire galaxy would eventually come to rely on, a place where any refugee from any war, human or alien, could find help without question. Years later, Illyra Voss would sometimes be asked by young students, human and Veyron and Corvani and Threll alike, studying the history of the war that had freed a third of the galaxy, why she had asked the Overlord that particular question, on that particular day, instead of simply demanding his death as so many had expected her to. Her answer never changed. Because I wanted him to understand something the Dominion never understood in 300 years, she would say. Mercy is not weakness, it is a choice. The Dominion never chose it, not once, because they believed choosing mercy meant admitting you were not strong enough to refuse it. We chose it anyway, not because we were weak, but because we were strong enough not to need cruelty to prove our strength. That is the difference between an empire built on fear and worlds built on something that actually lasts. And on a small blue world that had once been dismissed as primitive and unremarkable, humanity continued building exactly that. Not an empire, not a dominion, something new, imperfect, and still growing, built by species who had learned, at terrible cost, that the strongest answer to cruelty was never more cruelty. It was the simple, stubborn choice to be better than the ones who had hurt you, even when you finally had every reason and every opportunity not to be. The rebuilding took far longer than the war itself. Freeing a world everyone in the Free Worlds Alliance quickly learned was only the beginning. Feeding, housing, and healing the survivors of 300 years of conquest was a task that would occupy the Alliance for decades to come, and it was a task that no single species could have managed alone. On Illyra's own homeworld, the deep ocean mining stations where she had once labored in secret were slowly converted, over the years that followed liberation, into research facilities dedicated to understanding and protecting the very ecosystems the Dominion had spent 3 centuries exploiting. The children who had once been taken to distant work camps, those who survived, were reunited with what remained of their families, though many had grown up entirely under Dominion supervision and struggled, for years afterward, to relearn what it meant to belong to a family rather than a work quota. Illyra spent long stretches of those years back on her homeworld, helping to rebuild not just its infrastructure, but its culture, working with elders to recover Veyron songs and traditions that had nearly been lost, songs that had been forbidden under Dominion rule for so long that entire generations had never heard them sung freely. The first time a full choir of Veyran voices sang the old songs of homecoming, openly, in the great glass halls of the rebuilt capital city. Illyra stood in the crowd, and wept without any attempt to hide it, and she was far from the only one. The Corvani worlds faced their own long road back, their ancient stone cities scarred by decades of forced mining, requiring careful restoration work, guided by descendants of the original builders who had passed down fragments of the old techniques, even under Dominion oppression. The Threll shipyards, once forced to build weapons of conquest, were repurposed to build something new entirely. Vessels designed for exploration, trade, and mutual aid between the growing family of free worlds, rather than instruments of war. Fleet Admiral Reyes remained a central figure throughout this long rebuilding, though he increasingly stepped back from military matters to focus on the harder, slower work of diplomacy. He helped draft the founding charter of what would eventually become simply known as the Alliance, a governing framework built explicitly to prevent any single species, including humanity itself, from ever accumulating the kind of unchecked power the Dominion had once wielded. It was a document born directly from hard lessons, and it included, at Reyes's insistence, a clause that many considered its most important, that any member world requesting aid in defending its freedom would receive it, without condition, from every other member capable of providing it. We built this because someone finally chose to help us when we had nothing to offer in return, he said during the charter's signing ceremony, standing beside representatives from a dozen species who had once been strangers, and were now, after everything they had endured together, something closer to family. The least we can do is make sure that choice is never left to chance again. Sarah Chen's network of hospitals and support centers grew alongside the Alliance itself, eventually becoming an independent humanitarian organization that operated across every liberated world, staffed by volunteers from every species involved, dedicated to a single simple principle that Sarah had carried with her since the day she first knelt beside a frightened Veyran refugee ship, that suffering did not require an explanation to deserve help. General Draven Kor, having testified extensively during the trial of Kos Threx, and having spent the years since assisting the Alliance in locating and dismantling the last remnants of Dominion military infrastructure scattered across former Imperial territory, eventually settled on a small agricultural world, far from the fighting he had spent his career participating in. He never sought forgiveness publicly, believing, as he told Illyra during one of their final conversations, that forgiveness was not something that could simply be requested. It had to be earned, slowly, through actions rather than words, and he intended to spend whatever years he had left trying to earn it, even knowing he might never fully succeed. Overlord Kos Threx, confined for the remainder of his exceptionally long life, was required each year to receive a formal report detailing the progress of rebuilding on every world he had once ruled. It was, the tribunal had decided, a fitting sentence for a being who had spent 3 centuries refusing to see the true cost of his conquests. He would not be permitted the comfort of ignorance ever again. Decades later, when Illyra Voss was asked to speak at the dedication of a new memorial built on Corveth Prime itself, a monument honoring every species that had suffered under Dominion rule, she looked out at a crowd unlike any that world had ever gathered, humans and Veyrans and Corvani and Threll, and a dozen other species standing together, free, in the very heart of what had once been the galaxy's greatest empire of fear. "We did not build this alliance because we were the strongest," she told them, her voice carrying easily now, steady and sure, in a way it had never been on the night she fled her homeworld all those years ago. "We built it because, when we finally had the power to choose, we chose to become something the Dominion never understood was possible. We chose to be strong enough not to need cruelty at all." The crowd's applause echoed across the memorial grounds, carried on a wind that, for the first time in 300 years, belonged to no empire and answered to no overlord, but simply to the free worlds that had, together, finally earned it.